What's up guys, James here, how are you doing? So this video is going to be a rebuttal to some of the claims made by Philip Bell in his creationism talk on the Bath Pavilion on the 18th of July. So Philip Bell has a degree in zoology, and also he's got all sorts of other letters after his name, and he's contributed to secular journals, etc. On paper, he does seem like an extremely intelligent bloke, and he is quite pleasant, but I was very disappointed by his talk. I was hoping for something a little bit more challenging. There was far too much of a focus on scripture for my liking as well, which, fair enough, he should be able to present some scripture. After all, he is talking about how science matches up with his creationism model, which comes from the Bible, so he has to be able to present the original claims made in the Bible. But again, too much focus on scripture for my personal liking. There was supposed to be another speaker as well, called Dominic Statham. I think he would have made for a more challenging rebuttal video, judging by some of the material I've seen of his online, and I'll leave a link to both Dominic and Philip's online profiles at the Creation Ministries. So I went with my good friend Jake. Known him for years. He's quite interested in this sort of stuff as well. And after the event, we went for a drink, and we met Alexander, I think that was his name, and Craig of the Bath Skeptic Society. And we have a photo, and I'll just flash up a photo of me, Jake, and Craig. I would have liked to have actually been able to record the entire speech, so I'd have been able to do a rebuttal where I actually deal with his direct quotes, but unfortunately the security there wouldn't allow it, and I didn't particularly want my video to be flagged. So I will be paraphrasing a lot of what he said. If I get any of this wrong, and you're watching, Philip, please feel free to correct me in the comment section, and I'll be able to deal with your claims more directly there. I was, however, allowed to take a couple of photos of the event, so I'll flash up a couple of pictures of Philip speaking. Okay, so I'm going to run through some of the claims made by Philip Bell then. Again, Philip, if you're watching this and I've got something wrong, please just comment down in the comment box below, and I'll get back to you. I am, of course, paraphrasing you because I couldn't record the whole thing, so correct me where I've misrepresented what you were saying. So, first off, he claims that Dawkins is a man of great faith, and he says that Dawkins has an absolute belief that there is no God. This is completely false. He quotes the God delusion in his talk various times, but he seems to have completely missed page 50 and page 51, where Dawkins talks about the 7-point scale from Gnostic theism to Gnostic absolute atheism, and he says that he himself would put himself on a 6 on that scale. It's not an absolute belief. He says that he's agnostic to God in the same way, to the same level that he's agnostic about fairies living at the bottom of his garden. Now, yeah, that's not an absolute belief. No matter how you try to argue it, that is not an absolute belief, and it's not a position of faith. Atheism is simply not believing in a God. It's not believing the claim that a God exists. It's up to the person who's making the positive claim to provide evidence, and you're allowed to not believe a claim for any reason you want until evidence is presented. So, yeah, atheism is simply the lack of faith. Calling people who accept evolution and and calling atheists people who have faith and calling them religious seems to be quite a common theme among his talks. Personally, I suspect that the reason he does this is that when he's backed into a corner and has to admit that he himself has faith, he can then turn around and say that, well, you have faith too, and you're religious too. But that kind of renders those terms completely meaningless if you're going to turn around and say everybody has faith and everybody's religious, which I think is a bit silly. By that logic, you can call not believing in fairies a religion, and you can call someone who supports Manchester United religious. It's completely ridiculous, and it renders those terms meaningless. And he also seems to think that people accepting evolution will lead them to not believing in an afterlife, and whilst yes, there may be a strong correlation between people who accept evolution and people who don't believe in an afterlife, the two are not mutually inclusive. Someone can accept evolution and also believe in some form of afterlife, or someone could reject both concepts. He also seems to confuse evolution and abiogenesis quite a lot. When he talks about evolution, he says he's referring to chemicals to man, and that's not how biologists look at it when they talk about evolution. They're talking about all life sharing a common ancestor. Evolution does not include how the first cells came to being. Trying to disprove all of evolution by basically suggesting that chemicals forming life is impossible would be like saying that Jimi Hendrix couldn't play the guitar because he didn't know how to chop down the tree, treat the wood, and form it into a guitar. I'd like to add here that for a short period of time I accepted evolution whilst being agnostic as to what the causes of the first cells were. The evidence for evolution was completely overwhelming, but I wasn't that aware of the evidence for abiogenesis at the time. He also quite a bit tries to cast credible doubt upon people by questioning what they know as absolute fact, and in reality there isn't really such a thing as an absolute fact. We could be wrong about absolutely everything, but we do have levels of certainty to different things. For example, in everyday usage, I would say that I'm certain I locked my door, and I have the level of certainty in that I'm willing to go about my life with the assumption that my door being locked is true. If I didn't do that, then I'd have to go around constantly double and triple checking absolutely everything. And it may be 1,000,000 to 1 chance that I didn't lock it, even though I remember doing so, perhaps a false memory got in there somehow. He also doesn't seem to understand the predictive nature of the scientific method, nor the falsifiability inherent within the scientific method, because he claims that his worldview of creationism fits with science, which, quite frankly, isn't true. Evolution has been tested time and time and time again, and each of the experiments designed to test it had falsifiability within them. If the experiments came back with results which didn't match with the evolutionary model, then that would have disproved evolution. He claims that there aren't any transitions or transitional fossils of dinosaurs, and he says that there's gaps in nearly every evolutionary series, and yes, there are a lot of gaps within the evolutionary series, quite a lot with dinosaurs, but we still have enough to show evolution among various species. and we can be reasonably certain of the interrelations between the fossils which we have found. I'll leave a link then to a list of transitional fossils below. But what I always think when people say that there's gaps in the series is, supposing you've got dinosaur 1 here, and you've got dinosaur 2, which appear to be related. They'll say, well, you're lacking a transition. So if we find that transition, you've then got twice as many gaps. Well, there's a transition between, where's the transitional between the first and the second, and where's the transitional between the second and the third? So, no matter how many fossils we have, they will still be arguing that. So, he says that fossils can't tell you how old they are, and that no fossil is buried with its birth certificate. In a way, he's right on a fossil not having a birth certificate, and he's right in the same way that bacon doesn't have a sell-by date on it. The packaging has the sell-by date on it. We can't directly date the fossils themselves, but we can use radiometric dating on the rocks which are around the fossils. So you're basically left with two options if you want to be able to refute that. First of all, you'd have to show me how radiometric dating is wrong, or alternatively, you're going to have to find an explanation as to how fossils seem to tunnel through solid rock and end up in a particular place. It also shows quite a few what you call living fossils, species which haven't changed that much, and well, there needs to be some forms can stay the same for hundreds of millions of years if there's no selective pressure for them to change. If a creature is particularly well adapted to its environment, then it won't change. A very, very simple example of that would be polar bears, and I'm not suggesting that polar bears are living fossils, but they're going to stay white if their environment is also white, because that's the best adaptation, and there's no reason for them to change colour. So, yeah, another thing to clarify, just because something doesn't appear to have physically changed that much, doesn't mean that it has stopped evolving. It just means that physically it hasn't changed very much. To give another example of this, if we look at the genetics of apes, if we look at bonobos and chimpanzees, genetically they're equidistant from human beings, because chimps and bonobos shared a common ancestor more recently than they shared a common ancestor with us, so they'll have diverged by about the same amount. If we take bonobos, chimpanzees and humans, we are all equidistant from gorillas, because we have all carried on genetically changing from a common ancestor. We, however, have physically changed a lot more than chimpanzees and bonobos, because we've evolved for life on the open plains, whereas they carried on evolving for life in jungles. He shows a fossil. He shows a photo of a fossil spider and says that scientists say that this came from the bottom of a lake. He says that this fossil seems consistent with the flood, with creationism and the flood account. And yes, that is consistent with the flood account, but that's just one fossil. I'd be quite amazed if we hadn't found any fossils which were formed because of a flood. But if creationism was true and that flood did happen, we should have evidence of an entire strata layer which showed only fossils which were formed in water, and we simply have not found that yet, and that would be consistent the world over. It also talks about how the Andes rocks were once underwater. Well, that can come down to simple plate tectonics. That's not particularly hard to explain. Now, And here's one thing which I did think was a bit silly. He insists that it's silly for someone to deny a global flood on Earth and believe in a global flood on Mars. Now, this is wrong on multiple levels. Firstly, that's kind of like saying, well, it's silly to believe in pink flamingos, but not believe in pink elephants. Well, we're just going where the evidence leads, in those kind of situations. It's also like saying, well, there's life on Earth, so it's silly to believe that there's no life on Jupiter. They are different environments. And as far as I know, there hasn't been a great global flood on Mars, but there is very strong evidence, which you can see with your own eyes, to show that at one point Mars did have a giant continent similar to what we believe Pangaea was like. So I'll flash up some images of that now. As you can see, this is an elevation map of Mars. Most of the northern hemisphere is extremely flat. One of the only other places we see in the solar system which is that flat is the ocean bed on Earth. And at the bottom, you can see what looks like the elevation map of a continent, and you can also see what appears to be rivers and streams and bays. There is other evidence for water previously being on Mars, but this is one of the simplest to demonstrate. Now, Mars being smaller than Earth, its core would have cooled a lot quicker, and with its core freezing, you lose the magnetosphere, which means that solar winds can then pick off the atmosphere and all of the water on the surface. So that's the evidence for the supercontinent on Mars and the ocean. But of course, also with it cooling quicker, there's not enough time for plate tectonics to crack apart the continent as it did on Earth. He also said he was going to talk about genetics, but he actually said very, very little on the topic, apart from that humans are all very closely related and we're all one race, and reference the Human Genome Project. Yes, we appear to be closely related, but we aren't 4,000 years removed from each other. It's a lot more than that. He also thinks that the amount of mutations per generation has increased as time goes on, and says we're on about 100 mutations a generation. At the present time, I've heard anywhere from 75 to 125, but 100 seems accurate enough. Now, if this was the case, and that Adam and Eve had no mutations, and Noah and his family only had a few, we'd expect phylogenetics to show that all human beings are even more closely related than they are at the moment. It'd show that we were possibly 1,000 years since the latest common ancestor, whereas genetics seems to suggest that the Homo sapiens have been around for about 250,000 years. Says there's no evidence of wingless to winged insects, and he's right, we do have very little transitional fossils showing the various forms along the way. There is a 65 million year gap in the insect record, I believe, but what we do see is that before that time we saw no winged insects, and after that time about half of all insects were winged. And there's various theories about how the wings could have developed. They wouldn't have developed for full flying straight away. They could have well been for gliding first of all. He also says the same thing about birds, and this is completely wrong. We have a very, very intricate record for the evolution of bird flight. Of course, I'll leave some links down in the description box below. He goes on to talk about the complexity of a feather, and how you've got I can't remember the names of the parts now. I'm not an expert on bird evolution, but I said that I will leave links down to somebody who is. But you've got the stalk bit, then you've got the main bits coming off of the feather, and then you've got tiny little sub bits coming off of them, and then they've got little hooks which hold the whole thing in place and give it a lot of structural support and make it extremely lightweight. But as I said, we do have intermediate fossils which show feathers which aren't quite that complicated. It says many times that life is too complex for a random process. Now, this is quite a bit of a straw man. Now, for evolution, you need three things to take place. Firstly, you need reproduction, you need mutation, and you need a selective pressure. Now, the selective pressure is a non-random process. It's not random that if you put a bunch of predators in with a bunch of prey, and you've got more predators there, then the prey will over time get faster. Another analogy using probability for this would be, say you've got 20 dice and they're d10s just to make it easier, so they've got 10 sides. You could have every human being on the planet throwing those for their entire life, once a second, throwing all 20 dice, and there's still a very low possibility that any of them would get all 10s. However, add a selective pressure to that, make it similar to Yahtzee, where once you throw the dice, you can keep the dice which are 10s, and throw only the dice which aren't 10s, then you would be very unlucky to not have 20 dice with all the 10s facing up in as little as 100 throws. He also compares laptops and that kind of thing to life, and so, well, look how complex laptops are. So, look how complex a cell is. It's millions of times more complicated. So, does that not also imply a designer? Well, no, because a laptop neither reproduces nor mutates, so it's not a valid analogy. There's two programs which I can recommend. One's called Evolisa or Evolisa, or however you pronounce it, which will use an evolutionary process to replicate photos. And there's also 3D creature evolution, which will start with random cuboids with random behaviour, which really does look quite random, and in as little as 100 generations, with as little as 50 organisms per generation, you can end up with things which appear to be shaped and move like frogs or insects or snakes. Pretty fascinating program, and that demonstrates that evolution can create the illusion of design when no designer is needed. So he says we need an explanation for the origin of information, and that the source of the information needs to be larger than the information itself. Well, there's a few things wrong with that. Firstly, we only call DNA information or a code for lack of a better word. The DNA, proteins, and RNA all act perfectly in line with the laws of physics and chemistry. They are not intelligent. It's pretty simple chemistry when you actually get down to it. And we'd call DNA information in the same way that we'd call stars information for somebody who travels by the stars, effectively. As for the source of the information needing to be larger than the information itself, not necessarily. But if you want to use that logic, then God has to be created by something which has more information than him. We've demonstrated that evolution can create extra can create extra information. There's various processes this can happen by. You can have a gene duplication, and then you can have then you've got an opportunity for that second gene to mutate and specialize for a different process. That's why we can look at gene families and that kind of thing. For example, we have three kinds of cone cells in our eyes, which see the three primary colours, and they all basically evolved from one single gene. Most of the animal kingdom doesn't see three primary colours like we do. So yeah, saying then that the information source needs to be larger than the information itself, then raises the question of where God comes from. Now, when this was pointed out, this did lead him to basically try to argue from William Lane Craig's viewpoint. I'm going to butcher this argument slightly, but less than other people have. So Craig's argument is basically everything that begins to exist has a cause, and everything that exists has a reason. Since the universe began to exist, it must have had a cause, and since whatever caused the universe is outside of time and therefore out of causality, it must exist for a reason, and that reason is that it exists from its own necessity. That almost seems like an intelligent argument, but to get from that to therefore the cause must be an all-knowing, all-powerful, benevolent God just really doesn't seem to follow, and I don't think that Craig has adequately made his case there, and nor do I think anyone else has, which I'm aware of. Now, Philip says that the Big Bang, that scientists say that the Big Bang happened for no reason. This is completely false. We do not claim to know what the reason is. That's not the same thing as it happened for no reason. We've got a good idea of what happened after the initial blank time, but before that we just don't know at the moment. But we are working on it, and we have a few different competing theories. Perhaps we will never know, but that doesn't mean we should simply insert God in there and say God did it. Whenever humanity's done that in the past, we have been wrong every single time. Lightning, God did it. Earthquakes, God did it. Volcanoes, God did it. Diseases, God did it. Whenever we've posited God as the answer, we have impeded progress. So yeah, no credible scientist that I'm aware of is saying that the Big Bang happened for no reason, but there is plenty of evidence to show that the Big Bang actually happened. Now, as for some of my reasons as to why I don't think that a God is responsible, if something which I would define as a God caused the Big Bang, then I think you'd expect to see some form of intervention in the universe, more you'd see some kind of purpose, some will behind it, but we don't see that. The universe seems completely impartial to us, and it just pretty much acts like clockwork, minus of course quantum effects there. So yeah, I don't think that that is a valid argument. And also you do get back to the complexity issue. Complexity does need ordered complexity does need a reason, and I don't see it existing of its own necessity as a valid answer to that. For you to say that something exists of its own necessity, you have to prove that that thing exists, and then you also have to prove why it simply must exist of its own necessity, and that case has not been adequately made. Next he goes on to talk about, he quotes George Wald in his famous talk about how spontaneous generation is impossible, and we choose to believe in the impossible. Now, I really could break that down and show why it's a quote mine, but instead I'll just leave a link down below, and I'll just simply say that even if he did say that, that was 1954, and spontaneous generation is absolutely worlds apart from from the various versions of abiogenesis. He also references New Scientist about how there's still huge gaps in our knowledge. Well, whoop-de-doo, there's huge gaps in our knowledge. So what? That's always going to be the case. That doesn't mean that the knowledge we do have is invalid. There is plenty of evidence for evolution. As I said before, looking at the insertion points of retroviruses in our genome does show that there was a common descent, at least with chimps and all the other great apes. But the only way that makes sense is via common descent or some form of trickster god who Philip himself says that he doesn't believe in. There's also the fact that phylogenetics matches near perfectly with the fossil record and radiometric dating as well, and that you can make predictions based on that about when the common ancestor between two species was around. You can do protein sequencing to find the same results as well. There's vestigial structures. Humans can be born with tails. Snakes can be born with legs. So can whales. Chickens can be born with teeth. Now, this only makes sense because the ancestors of those various creatures had those traits. Our ancient ancestors of ours, going back millions of years, did have tails. If we were created as we are, then we wouldn't have the genetic information available for us to grow tails. The reason that certain humans develop them is because normally those genes are deactivated, but in some cases there's mutations which happen which lead them to be reactivated again. Now, if we were to find a structure such as feathers on cats or birds with tentacles or anything like that, that would instantly disprove evolution because the ancestors of those creatures didn't have those traits. So that's another way that evolution can be falsified, and if creationists want to do some research on that, please by all means go ahead. I don't think that it's going to happen somehow. Of course, that does fit. Of course, those things would be absolutely fine within creationism. You can have Pegasus, I don't know, you can have griffins, that kind of thing. That doesn't conflict with creationism one bit, but it would instantly disprove evolution. Another thing about vestigial structures, things such as wisdom teeth, the appendix, and tonsils, I've heard various arguments that they do in fact serve some form of purpose, but even so, if they do serve any form of purpose, the fact remains that they are still far more likely to kill you than to help you. You're more likely to survive without them than you are with them. So, did God make some form of mistake there? To argue that the appendix is some form of intelligent design would be like arguing that a fire alarm which has a 50% chance of setting on fire and burning your house down, but only a 10% chance of actually going off when a real fire is present, is a form of intelligent design. The worst cowboy builder in history wouldn't make those kind of mistakes. He also talks about how Francis Crick and Richard Dawkins believe in transpermia, and they never said that they believe it. They said that that was a possibility which they aren't ruling out, which does in fact seem fair when we look at the atmospheres of certain planets, even exoplanets, which have organic molecules in them. We found comets which have amino acids in them as well. All of the building blocks for life appear to be able to form perfectly well outside of Earth. So it seems like a valid hypothesis. There's just very little evidence that that's the case at the moment. They're not ruling it out. They're not saying that that's what they actually believe. So he says that he's not arguing against microevolution. He goes on to talk about Darwin's finches, and then he says that yes, you can have different varieties of finches, but a finch will never become anything other than a finch. Well, you know what? I'm glad that we actually agree on something. Evolution doesn't say that a finch will evolve to become anything other than a finch, and it doesn't say that something else can evolve. Something else will evolve into a finch. Something doesn't stop being what it was previously. Evolution only modifies on what was available before. To give an example of this, we are still apes, we are still monkeys, we are still placental mammals, we're still mammals, we're still terrestrial vertebrates, we're still fish. Now that's a very controversial statement, but biologically the word fish means absolutely nothing. We're closer related to rayfin fish than we are to lampreys, and we're closer related to lampreys than we are to hagfish. Hagfish are further removed from other fish than they are to us. We're still vertebrates. We're still chordata, and we're still eukaryotes. You don't stop being what you were before, no matter how much change takes place. So. Another example would be Kit, the talking car and Knight Rider. Just because it can suddenly talk doesn't mean that it's no longer a car anymore. So yes, whatever finches evolve into, they will still be recognised. They will still be recognised as finches. It's just that finch will then stop being a species and become a genus instead. So yeah, more notes. Again, he's confusing evolution with abiogenesis. He also says that pit bulls are caused by a mutation, which seems strange because he seems to think, in some ways, he seems to think that mutations don't take place. So yeah, back to the microevolution thing. I can actually kind of understand this from a young Earth perspective, where there simply isn't enough time for massive amounts of change to take place. But for old Earth creationists, they really need to be able to posit some form of mechanism which prevents macroevolution from taking place. And this macroevolution has been redefined many times over the years. Firstly, creationists didn't believe that mutations can be positive. Then they believed that mutations couldn't cause an increase in information. Then they thought that it couldn't cause speciation, and now they're just reverting back to kind and not giving a clear definition on what a kind is. Now, if they were right, the word kind would be extremely easy to define biologically, but it's really not, because there really are no dividing lines there which we can see. We can look at phylogeny and recognise that we're related to all other apes, that we're related to all other monkeys, that we're related to all other mammals, blah 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 blah. Phylogenetics proves this beyond any form of reasonable doubt. And of course, he didn't even touch on the topic of phylogenetics, just as I haven't yet seen any creationist make a valid argument against it. Let's see. I've got another thing here about no fossil being buried with its birth certificate, which I believe I've already covered. He also talks about how we end up with different figures to do with how closely DNA matches between us and chimps. How scientists keep coming out with different figures such as 0.5 and 98.6 and 69. Rambles off a whole load of other figures which I don't believe he actually gave any sources to. But what I do know is that the different figures which we arrive at depend on how and what we are actually testing. For example, if we're testing the coding regions of the DNA, we come to a figure of it's either 0.5, 0.4 or 0.5. I can't quite remember at the moment. So if we look at the whole genome-wide non-coding regions, we end up with, I think it's 98.6. That's to be expected. The non-coding regions go under less selective pressure. Because they don't just create proteins which do need to be quite well conserved in many cases. Some of them regulate how much of a protein's produced, some of them just give structural support to the DNA, some of it comes from retroviruses, and that code really does seem to do very, very little. And there's also other non-coding DNA which seems to do absolutely nothing as well. He has talked about how a lot of the code, a lot of the junk DNA does seem to have a purpose, but again, it's not. Scientists very rarely talk about junk DNA. However, as I said, there is some code which does seem to be effectively what you would call junk. There's a study done with mice where they removed 2.3 million base pairs of DNA, and they carried on developing completely normally with no problems whatsoever, which seems to suggest that if that code does do anything, it seems to have very little purpose. But yeah, the different figures depend on exactly what you're testing, whether you're testing coding region, non-coding region, specific proteins which could be under different selective pressures, or you're looking at chromosomes. He also said that we share 50% of our DNA in common with bananas, and everyone laughed at that. They thought it was hilarious. But this is quite well expected as well. We, of course, do share DNA with plants. We are related. Plants and animals are both eukaryotes. There's certain things which we do need to share in common. We need the same DNA to transcribe proteins, to copy the DNA, and all of that kind of thing. So it's no surprise that we get a figure even as high as 50%. Now, the rest of his talk after that seemed to be was just quoting scripture and talking about the problems with today's society. He says that human beings were created perfect, and immediately this seems to be a bit silly, because if we are created perfect, then we wouldn't have failed in the Garden of Eden. God basically set us up to fail. He talks about how we've become a feelings-led culture. And yeah, I think that most people are led very much by feelings. That's not necessarily a problem in all cases, but I don't think that we have become a feelings-led culture. We always have been, and within our academic circles, we are becoming more logical. There's setbacks along the way. There's certain fields of academia which I have strong disagreements with, but we are getting better and more scientific. We are not becoming more feelings-led. Says that, well, we're wired for sin. Well, evolution would predict that we are wired to sin as well. It also evolution also explains the origins of empathy and what some people would call morality. For example, if we lived in a society where killing, where the average person killed more people than he reproduced, then that society would die out. That's pretty simple. Also, the concept of possession would be completely meaningless if the average person stole more things than they acquired legitimately, and the concept of language would be completely redundant if we lied more than we told the truth. He talks about how so many 15-year-olds, I can't remember the figures he gave, are drinking and smoking and fighting. He doesn't leave anything for comparison there. He doesn't say, well, look how it was in 1970. He just says, well, look how it was on this date, and it's all look how this is really terrible. Well, 15-year-olds have been having sex and fighting. All have been fighting since there were 15-year-olds. He does nothing to show that this has actually got particularly worse, and in many ways we're actually living in a far safer society today than we ever have been. So I don't think he adequately made the case that we are deteriorating in any such way like that. And finally, he talks about how people who believe in evolution are undermining the word of God. Well, yeah, we are undermining the literal interpretation of Genesis, so that kind of goes without saying there. I kind of wish I could have recorded it and taken a few more notes than I did, but hopefully I've dealt with many of what I believe to be the false assertions which he's made, and I'll leave links to as many things as I can which back up my case below. Anyway, thanks for watching, guys. Comment, rate, subscribe, and I'll see you soon. Bye.